Evan Mercer had always believed silence was a kind of armor, thin, fragile, but enough to hold back whatever threatened to overwhelm him. Yet as he stood in the dim hallway of his family home, listening to Caleb Rourke's footsteps approaching, he realized his armor was beginning to crack. Moving back into the house had been a temporary decision, a financial detour after a job collapse, but the emotional weight of this place had arrived instantly, clinging to him like humidity in late summer. Caleb appeared at the far end of the hall, crisp shirt sleeves rolled above his elbows, expression set in its usual mixture of confidence and impatience. At 48, Caleb carried himself with the deliberate sharpness of someone who needed the world to recognize him. His presence was neither aggressive nor comforting, only dense, as if every room shifted beneath his mood. "You're up early," Caleb said, voice smooth but edged. "Planning something for the day?" Evan kept his shoulders relaxed. "Just heading out for coffee." "With who?" The question landed with the familiar weight of scrutiny. Caleb had a way of asking ordinary things as if they were cross-examination. "Nobody," Evan replied. "Just coffee." Caleb nodded slowly, unsatisfied but unwilling to push further, for now. He moved past Evan, leaving behind the faint scent of cologne and the pressure of unspoken expectations. The exchange lasted seconds, but it ignited the tension that had been simmering since Evan returned home. Caleb's need to supervise, to guide, to shape, to correct. Evan stepped outside into the cool morning air and exhaled, as if he'd been holding his breath since their conversation began. He walked the 4 blocks to Harbor Lane, where a small corner cafe sat tucked between a bookstore and a tailor's shop. He had discovered it by accident his first week back, and it quickly became his temporary sanctuary. Inside, soft jazz spilled from ceiling speakers, and the aroma of roasted beans cut through his restlessness. He ordered his usual and sat by the window, watching early commuters drift past. It was there, mid-sip, that he first noticed the man sketching at the next table, tall, quietly absorbed in his work, with messy auburn hair and hands stained faintly with charcoal. Mason Hale radiated a calm that contrasted sharply with Caleb's constant vigilance. Evan tried not to stare, but curiosity tugged at him. He wasn't used to noticing people so quickly. Mason glanced up, caught Evan looking, and smiled, an unguarded, warm smile that felt completely different from the measured ones Evan had grown accustomed to at home. "Good morning," Mason said. His voice carried a softness, like he'd learned to measure his words carefully, not out of fear but out of consideration. Evan returned the smile. "Morning. What are you working on?" Mason angled his sketchbook just enough for Evan to see, a loosely drawn portrait of an older couple laughing on a park bench. Evan admired the movement in the lines, the way Mason captured emotion rather than detail. "That's impressive," Evan said, "just a warm-up." "Helps my brain wake up," Mason replied. "Are you from around here?" "Kind of." Evan hesitated, choosing his words. "I grew up here. Moved away. Now I'm back for a while." Mason nodded, sensing the heaviness Evan didn't articulate. "Well, if you ever need company here, I'm usually around." The conversation drifted from art to music to trivial morning observations, each exchange smoothing the edge of the day. It lasted maybe 10 minutes, but by the time Evan left, he realized the emptiness he'd carried had shifted, just slightly, but noticeably. When he returned home, the house felt heavier than before. It wasn't the walls or the narrow hallways, it was the awareness that he'd felt lighter elsewhere. And deeply, stubbornly, Caleb sensed it too. Caleb looked up from the dining table as Evan stepped inside. "You were gone longer than usual." A statement, not a question. "I took a walk after coffee," Evan answered, keeping his tone neutral. "With someone?" Caleb pressed. Evan swallowed, irritation flickering under his restraint. "Caleb. I really need you to stop monitoring everything I do." It was the first time he said it directly. The air in the room tightened, as if the walls leaned in to listen. Caleb raised an eyebrow. "Monitoring? That's dramatic. I'm trying to help you rebuild your life. I care. Someone has to." The emphasis was too sharp, too pointed. Evan felt the old frustration rise, but he kept himself grounded. "I appreciate concern. I don't appreciate control." Caleb stood slowly, pushing his chair back with deliberate calm. Your mother worries. I check in so she doesn't have to. Evan remained silent. They both knew Linda rarely involved herself in these tensions. She avoided conflict with a kind of practiced grace that left Evan mostly alone in the middle. Caleb exhaled, a controlled breath. If you're seeing someone new, if that's what this is, just be careful. People aren't always what they seem. Evan blinked, taken aback. I just got coffee, that's all. Caleb didn't respond. His gaze was sharp, calculating, as though he were trying to read the parts of Evan he didn't have access to. Then he walked away without another word, but his silence carried more suspicion than any accusation could. The rest of the day moved slowly. Evan tried to focus on job applications, but his mind drifted repeatedly, first to Mason's sketch, then to Caleb's probing gaze. The contrast between them unsettled him in ways he couldn't fully name. That evening, as Evan stepped into his room to finally retreat into quiet, his phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. Hey, it's Mason, from the cafe. If you're around tomorrow, I'd like to show you something I think you'll appreciate. No pressure. A small smile tugged at Evan's lips. The message felt gentle, unassuming, something refreshing in a house filled with tension that he typed back a simple sure. What time? Before he could settle into bed, a shadow crossed his doorway. Caleb stood there, expression unreadable. You're going out tomorrow? He asked. Evan froze. Caleb, please. I just want privacy. Caleb didn't budge. I'm not stopping you. I just think you should be careful about who you trust. There it was again, that same note of implication, as if Caleb sensed too much yet understood too little. Evan drew a breath and met his gaze calmly. I'll be fine. And he would be. At least, he hoped so. As the door closed, Evan felt something shift, subtle but significant. For the first time since returning home, he sensed the possibility of a life beyond these suffocating walls. But he also sensed something else. Caleb wasn't done asking questions, and the road ahead was about to twist in ways he hadn't imagined. The room went quiet, but suspense settled deeper, as if the story he hadn't meant to start was already unfolding without permission. Evan woke the next morning with a sense of quiet unease. The previous night's encounter lingered in his thoughts, not the laughter or the polite introductions, but the way Caleb's attention had softened when Liam entered the room. It was subtle, nearly imperceptible to anyone else, yet it struck Evan with the force of recognition. Something had shifted, and it was no longer confined to hushed glances or missed conversations. At a tea breakfast, Caleb seemed distracted, stirring his coffee absent-mindedly as though he were mentally elsewhere. He smiled at Evan when spoken to, but the warmth felt delayed, filtered through an invisible veil. Evan chose not to comment immediately, instead watching the familiar movements, the way Caleb's hand lingered near his mug a moment longer than necessary, and the faint crease between his brows that hadn't been there before. You're quiet today, Caleb remarked, finally breaking the tension with a casual tone. Just thinking, Evan said, letting his words hang. About work, life, whatever. Caleb nodded, but his eyes flicked toward the phone charging on the counter. Evan noticed how quickly Caleb's gaze returned to his plate, almost as if he were guarding his own attention. Something about the timing felt deliberate. Not malicious, not deceitful, but careful. Careful enough that Evan sensed a deeper story simmering beneath the surface. The day unfolded with its usual rhythm, Evan working from home, Caleb disappearing for meetings and phone calls, the silence between them stretching thin. Yet even in the routine, Evan detected subtle changes. Caleb's messages were shorter, his laughter lighter, almost rehearsed. Evan wondered whether he imagined it, or whether Caleb was consciously building a wall he hadn't yet acknowledged. By evening, Evan decided he could no longer ignore the feeling. He suggested a walk through the neighborhood, hoping that movement and fresh air would loosen the invisible tension. Caleb agreed, seemingly without hesitation, but Evan noted the brief hesitation in his posture, the way his shoulders tensed as they stepped out into the cool twilight. They walked side by side, passing familiar streets and streetlights casting long shadows. Evan chose his words carefully, cautious not to confront, only to invite. Are you happy? He asked. Caleb's stride faltered, and he glanced at Evan briefly before looking ahead. "I think so. Some days are better than others." Evan didn't press, though he sensed the avoidance. He had learned over the years that pressing too hard often led to walls, not answers. Still, he couldn't shake the sense that Caleb's quiet wish, the one he carried like a secret weight, was becoming more tangible, more insistent. That a few days later, Evan noticed a new pattern: Caleb leaving the house with his laptop bag in the morning, returning later than he claimed, his energy slightly elevated after long phone calls. Evan observed the changes in small increments, cataloging each as if they were puzzle pieces, hoping they would form a coherent picture. But they did not. Instead, they created tension, unease, and the persistent hum of suspicion. Then, one afternoon, Evan discovered a small, folded note tucked under a stack of mail. The handwriting was unmistakable, Caleb's. He hesitated before unfolding it, unsure whether he wanted to read it or leave it for another day. But curiosity, mingled with fear, won. The note was brief, almost fragile. "I wish I could tell you everything. But I don't know if I can. I hope you'll understand someday." Evan's hands trembled slightly as he refolded the paper. Nothing explicit, nothing detailed, just a quiet admission of longing, a confession that something unspoken existed between them. The words confirmed what Evan had suspected all along: Caleb carried a wish, a desire, a thought he hadn't yet shared. But the note offered no clarity on whether that wish included Evan or someone else entirely. The tension in the house grew heavier after that. Evan began noticing Caleb's subtle gestures toward Liam, the way Caleb's voice brightened when he spoke of project deadlines that coincided with Liam's visits, or the way he lingered on Liam's messages, smiling softly when reading them alone in another room. Evan didn't want to confront, didn't want to accuse. But he couldn't ignore the evidence his own heart and mind were piecing together. One evening, Evan found himself alone in the living room, scrolling through his own thoughts more than any actual messages. He realized that Caleb's affection for him was still there. It hadn't disappeared, but it was shaded now, filtered through unspoken emotions. The man he loved was struggling between the life they had built and a desire he hadn't shared. And the longer it remained unsaid, the further Evan felt himself from the person he thought he knew. When Caleb returned home that night, he seemed restless. The usual calmness was replaced by a subtle energy, a vibration Evan could feel when he stepped into the room. Caleb spoke softly, almost cautiously. "Evan. I need to tell you something." Evan's stomach tightened. He had waited for this moment, dreaded it, and hoped for it all at once. "Okay," he said. His voice was steady, but his pulse raced. Caleb hesitated, his eyes searching Evan's face as if measuring how much of the truth could be revealed without shattering them both. Then, just as he began to speak, a notification chimed on his phone. Caleb's expression shifted, and he turned away, swiping the screen with practiced ease. "I'll tell you later," Caleb murmured. Evan swallowed the disappointment, sensing that the conversation he needed most would be delayed again. The night continued with polite routine: dinner, laughter faintly forced, an early retreat to separate rooms. But the weight of Caleb's unspoken words pressed down on Evan, heavier than anything he could have imagined. As Evan lay awake, he replayed every interaction, every glance, every smile Caleb had given Liam in recent days. The images weren't dramatic, not threatening, but they were intimate in a way only emotional connection can be. Evan understood, with a painful clarity, that Caleb's quiet wish was no longer a vague thought. It had taken form, and its gravity reached far beyond the walls of their apartment. By the time dawn broke, Evan made a silent promise to himself: he would confront the truth, whatever it was. He didn't yet know how, or when, or what he would find. But he knew that the quiet wish Caleb carried would not remain hidden much longer, and that when it surfaced, nothing would ever be the same. It was no longer just tension or distance. It was a turning point, and Evan felt it in the hollow ache of anticipation, the awareness that love and longing can coexist, even when their paths diverged. He closed his eyes, waiting for the inevitable, knowing that the coming days would force choices, revelations, and consequences he could no longer avoid. And with that understanding came the first real stirrings of fear, hope, and a fragile courage he didn't yet fully recognize. The rain had stopped by dawn, leaving the air clear and cold. Ethan stood outside for a while, watching the slow drift of mist along the hedges, trying to shake the strange restlessness that had settled over him. Inside, the sound of a kettle boiling broke the silence, followed by Daniel's steady movements in the kitchen. Liam was still asleep, his door closed. Ethan lingered in the hallway before finally stepping inside the kitchen. Daniel glanced up from the counter, his usual calm expression softening into something that looked almost welcoming. "Couldn't sleep?" Daniel asked. Ethan shook his head. "I guess I'm not used to quiet houses." Daniel smiled faintly. "You'll learn to appreciate it with age." He set a mug of coffee in front of Ethan, then leaned back against the counter. There was no tension in his voice, only a quiet ease that made Ethan's chest tighten. They talked about small things at first: college, work, the weather. But gradually, the conversation shifted, guided by the unspoken curiosity that had begun to form between them. Daniel asked questions in a way that felt deliberate but not invasive, as though he genuinely wanted to understand Ethan, not just fill the silence. Ethan found himself answering more honestly than he expected. "Sometimes," he said, tracing the rim of his mug, "I feel like I'm just going through the motions. I'm doing everything I'm supposed to, but I'm not sure why." Daniel's eyes lifted to meet his. "That feeling doesn't go away with age," he said quietly. "You just learn to live around it." The words lingered. There was no advice in them, no attempt to fix anything, just recognition. Ethan felt oddly seen in that moment, in a way that unsettled him more than comforted him. When Liam finally came down, the moment dissolved into ordinary noise, toast popping, laughter returning, Daniel stepping back into the role of polite father. But something had changed between him and Ethan. A quiet understanding had taken root, fragile and unspoken. Later that afternoon, Liam left to meet some friends, leaving Ethan behind. Daniel offered to drive him into town, but Ethan declined, saying he needed a little air. He walked instead, following a narrow path that led through the woods behind the house. The trees were still damp from the rain, their branches dripping onto the path. Half an hour later, he heard footsteps behind him. When he turned, Daniel was there, hands in his pockets, smiling faintly. "Didn't mean to follow," he said. "I just needed the same air, I suppose." Ethan smiled back, though his pulse quickened. They walked together without speaking for a while, the sound of leaves crunching beneath their shoes filling the silence. "You and Liam seem close," Daniel said eventually. "Yeah," Ethan replied. "He's one of the few people who doesn't try to make me someone else." Daniel nodded. "That's rare. Most friendships fade when people realize who you really are." Ethan glanced at him, unsure how to respond. "Does that happen to you?" Daniel hesitated, then said, "More often than I'd like to admit." They reached a clearing where the sunlight broke through in thin strips of gold. Daniel stopped, looking out over the quiet landscape. "Marriage teaches you a lot about silence," he said after a moment. "About pretending everything's fine when it isn't." Ethan's stomach tightened. He wanted to ask why he was telling him this, but the words stuck in his throat. Daniel looked at him, his gaze steady but not intense this time, just open. "Don't mistake me," he said. "I'm not unhappy. Just tired of pretending that's the same thing as being content." There was no accusation in his tone, no self-pity. It was simply the truth, laid bare. Ethan felt a flicker of empathy that bordered on something deeper. "I think people settle," Ethan said softly. "Not because they stop wanting more, but because they stop believing they deserve it." Daniel's lips curved faintly. "That's a wise thing to say for someone your age." Ethan shrugged. "Maybe I've just seen enough people give up." For a moment, their eyes met again, and Ethan saw the weight behind Daniel's calmness, a quiet loneliness that felt both familiar and foreign. The kind of loneliness that doesn't come from being alone, but from being unseen. They walked back in silence, both aware of what was growing between them but unwilling to name it. By the time they reached the house, the light had begun to fade. That evening, Liam called to say he'd be staying at a friend's place overnight. Ethan didn't react, though he felt the atmosphere shift immediately. The house seemed too large, the walls too quiet. Daniel prepared a simple dinner, insisting Ethan join him. Over the meal, conversation drifted easily again. Daniel asked about Ethan's parents, his plans, his fears. Ethan found himself revealing things he rarely told anyone, his doubts, his longing for something genuine, his confusion about where he fit in the world. Daniel listened without interruption, eyes thoughtful, expression unreadable. When dinner ended, they lingered at the table, neither ready to leave. Daniel finally said, "You remind me of myself when I was younger. Except you have the courage to admit what I couldn't." Ethan looked up. "And what was that?" "That I was lonely," Daniel said simply. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable, it was full, almost heavy. Ethan felt words forming in his chest, but before he could speak, Daniel stood, clearing the table. "It's getting late," he said quietly. "You should rest." Ethan nodded, though part of him didn't want the moment to end. As he turned to leave, Daniel's voice stopped him. "Ethan." He turned back. Daniel's eyes held his, steady and calm. "Thank you for listening," he said. "Not everyone does." Ethan didn't know what to say, so he only nodded. But as he walked down the hallway, he could still feel Daniel's gaze following him, not heavy, not prying, just there. That night, Ethan lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The air felt charged with something he couldn't name. His thoughts circled back to Daniel, his restraint, his sadness, the quiet sincerity in his words. Ethan felt drawn to it, not out of curiosity, but out of understanding. He knew what it was to hide behind composure. His phone buzzed suddenly, startling him. The message was short, simple. "Daniel, can we talk privately before you leave tomorrow?" Ethan stared at the screen, the soft glow lighting the room. His pulse quickened, though he didn't know why. There was nothing inappropriate in the message, yet it felt like the threshold of something delicate, something dangerous. That he typed a brief reply, "Sure." Setting the phone aside, he turned off the light, lying back in the dark. Outside, the rain began again, gentle, steady, familiar. But inside, everything felt different. That he didn't know what Daniel wanted to say, or what he might confess. He only knew that tomorrow, something between them would change forever, and as he drifted into uneasy sleep, the thought returned like a quiet whisper: maybe this story wasn't about being wanted. Maybe it was about being seen.